What is RAD/PACT? Today we are going to run a workshop explaining how NYCHA is trying to fix their building maintenance issues and why we have come to a moment of such neglect. They have a few different plans for how to do this, and we will talk about what they are, but our focus today will be on RAD/PACT. We'll also talk about what NYCHA says are the benefits and drawbacks and resident experiences, so that we can decide whether we support these programs or not. What has living in public housing meant to you what do NYCHA residents need? This slide is meant to engage residents and to allow people to say what they need, instead of the other way around, in order to provide an anchoring point when considering whether NYCHA's plans meet those needs. NYCHA manages public housing buildings in NYCHA. Around 600,000 people live in NYCHA buildings. What has living in public housing meant to you? What do you, as NYCHA residents, need? What is Section 9 public housing? Section 9 is traditional public housing as we know it. Written into law as part of the Housing Act of 1937, Section 9 established a federal program to provide funding to local governments or housing authorities to build and manage new clean and safe housing. It established housing that was directly funded by the government with the recognition that housing is a right. What makes Section 9 unique is that it provides deeply affordable housing for hundreds of thousands of families across NYCHA because rent is capped at 30% of a household's income and is adjusted or deducted for households with elderly members, members with disabilities, minors, and/or students to ensure housing stability. No yearly rent increases or losing a home because you lost a job. Section 9 public housing is the most stable form of housing in the country. Due to decades of resident organizing and activism, Section 9 or public housing residents have the strongest, most robust set of tenants' rights in the country, including the right to organize an association, have office and meeting space, have funds for activities, have a say in the day-to-day management and administration, and to create their own resident management corporation if they are not satisfied with management. Lastly, but definitely not all, Section 9 includes resources and programs to enhance economic and community development. For example, Section 3 is a program that prioritizes labor contracts with local Section 9 resident small businesses. So if you are, for example, a painter or exterminator, you will have first dibs on a relevant project happening in your development. Moreover, Section 9 residents have the right to a family investment center where they can access educational and employment opportunities, including training, counseling, childcare, supportive healthcare services, and more. This may include activities funded by Resident Opportunity Self-Sufficiency and/or Family Self-Sufficiency programs. Apartments these days do not come with this robust infrastructure that really enables us to create a sense and structure of community like we have here. NYCHA keeps saying it needs money for repairs. How did we get here? Because of lack of funding, NYCHA buildings now need $78 billion in repairs over the next 20 years. Some of the money that pays for NYCHA comes from the city and state governments, but most of it comes from the federal government in Washington, D.C. The problem is that, for decades, the federal government has been steadily reducing the amount of money they pay to NYCHA. Before we get into the current issues NYCHA and NYCHA residents face, we want to spend some time putting our current moment into historical context so that we can consider the causes for the current failings of public housing. Federal disinvestment and political choices. First, we have to acknowledge that the lack of funding are political choices being made by our government officials. It's important to remember that there was a period of time when our priorities were switched. The chart on the left shows how the U.S. government used to prioritize affordable public housing over private homeownership and wealthy buyers. Now it spends far more money on subsidizing housing for the rich than it spends on housing for low-income people. The chart on the right also shows how much federal money for affordable housing dropped beginning in the 1970s. So the big question is, why did this start happening in the 1970s? Timeline. How residents and public housing advocates fought back. 1937. The Federal Housing Act authorized Section 9 public housing construction. 1970s. Nixon shifted focus to privatization with the Section 8 program, relying on private landlords. 1980s. HUD funding was slashed from $83B to $18B. The low-income housing tax credit incentivized private investment over direct public housing funding. 1996, HUD funding for new public housing was cut to zero. Hope 6 led to demolitions and displacement. 2012, RAD, Rental Assistance Demonstration, was introduced, continuing privatization efforts. Despite these cuts, residents fought back, organized strikes against rent hikes, protested for the right to participate in management, formed resident associations, pushed lawsuits, leading to reforms like the Mold and Leaks Ombudsman, advocated for the Preservation Trust vote, initially excluded from public discussion, federal disinvestment and political choices. To be clear, the source of funding for Section 8 and Section 9 public housing is the same Congress, our federal government. Since the early 2000s, Section 8 funding has steadily increased, while public housing funding has plummeted. However, we see a huge spike in funding in 2009 due to on-the-ground organizing and activism of public housing residents. Although this graph might convey despair, there is still a sign of hope of how we can make change. National Housing Law Project's timeline. Here is another timeline that has a more detailed history of the kind of programs and policies that HUD has implemented to undermine and privatize or demolish public housing for people who may want to do more research. How does public housing, Section 9 funding work? As a quick reminder, traditionally, the federal government gives money to NYCHA, and NYCHA uses that money to manage the building. Tenants pay up to 30% of their income back to NYCHA in rent. Additionally, we, the tenants, pay our taxes, and that money goes to Congress for yearly appropriations, including funding for NYCHA. So there is a direct, cyclical nature to our funding. What's NYCHA's plan? So now that we know where we are and the moment that we are in, what is NYCHA's new plan? NYCHA has two ideas to raise funds. Has anyone heard of these ideas and know what they're called? RAD/PACT and infill are two examples. NYCHA wants to use these plans to try and get private developers and landlords to take over the responsibility of maintaining and repairing NYCHA buildings. Infill, for example, takes NYCHA land, like playgrounds and parking lots, and builds new market-rate buildings to subsidize the costs of repairs to current NYCHA buildings. There are a few different programs that are designed to get private landlords and developers involved. RAD/PACT, infill, transfer of development rights, TDR, and the Preservation Trust. Today we are going to go through the basics of the RAD/PACT program so you can decide if you support it or want to advocate against it. If you plan on talking about other programs in addition to RAD/PACT, you can introduce them here. What is RAD/PACT? Does anyone know what RAD stands for? It stands for Rental Assistance Demonstration Program. RAD is what the federal government calls it. NYCHA decided to call it PACT Permanent Affordability Commitment together. RAD and PACT work in the same way. You might hear it called either of these names depending on whether someone is talking about it from the perspective of the federal government or NYCHA. And you might also hear it called PACT to Preserve. Does anyone know what the basic idea behind RAD/PACT is? Generally, it allows NYCHA to transfer its buildings to private landlords who then manage the buildings instead of NYCHA. It's a way for NYCHA to transfer responsibility for buildings to private developers and landlords so it doesn't have to maintain them anymore. How does RAD/PACT work? Tenants pay 30% of their income in rent, but they pay it to the private landlord instead of NYCHA. The building is removed from public housing portfolio and changed into a project-based Section 8 building. Let's look at how that works. What is a Section 8 building? While the federal government doesn't want to fund public housing directly, they are willing to fund private landlords with public money. Section 8 is a program that does that. Raise your hand if you've heard of Section 8. Does anyone know how it works? If someone knows, let them explain. Otherwise, say. In projects-based Section 8, a tenant lives in a building managed by a private landlord. This landlord gets two payments for each apartment, one from the tenant, who pays 30% of their income, and the other from the federal government, which pays the balance of rent. The total of both payments added together equals the fair market rent, which is just a fancy way of saying the average rent that a private landlord in the area can charge for any private apartment. This can be confusing, so make sure everyone gets it before moving on. So let's go over that slowly one more time. In any project-based Section 8 apartment, the tenant pays 30% of their income, and the federal government pays more money, on top of that, to add up to the fair market rent. Both payments go to the private landlord. This kind of Section 8 voucher is for the apartment only, not the tenant. So again, there are two kinds of Section 8. The tenant-based Section 8 voucher program and the project-based Section 8 program. In project-based Section 8, the whole building is in the Section 8 program, and if a resident leaves, they can't take the Section 8 benefits with them. In the voucher program, a tenant can go to any private building and try to get the landlord to accept their Section 8 voucher and take them as a tenant. RAD/PACT is project-based Section 8. It's converting the public housing building to a project-based Section 8 building. Basically, all RAD/PACT is doing is converting buildings from Section 9 public housing, where the federal government pays NYCHA to run the buildings, to project-based Section 8, where the federal government is subsidizing a private landlord to run the buildings. How does RAD/PACT work? Current Section 9 public housing. We move from a model of direct government funding. How does RAD/PACT work? RAD/PACT conversions to a model where the federal government gives our taxpayer dollars to private landlords and private management companies. NYCHA leases the building to a private landlord who will receive federal funding from Congress via Section 8 project-based rental assistance. The landlord or company will manage the building and continue to collect 30% of our income. Different program, different lease. It is important to note that this conversion means you will no longer be a Section 9 public housing resident, so you will no longer have a Section 9 lease. Instead, you will be a tenant at a project-based Section 8 development and will sign a PACT lease. Although you will continue to pay 30% of your income, please note that within the lease, a PACT partner or property may require a tenant to pay other charges and fees. From slide, PACT partners/property managers can charge tenants for utilities like gas and electricity, as well as for unit and appliance damages. This is an excerpt from the lease. NYCHA sample PACT lease example. Here is another excerpt from the PACT lease. So we implore tenants to look over all of the fine print of any new leases at developments undergoing conversion. We are deeply concerned about how this may impact residents on fixed incomes. How many apartments have been converted? NYCHA has approval to convert 62,000 of the total 176,000 units to RAD/PACT. Since 2016, NYCHA has converted a total of 23,312 units. Converted RAD developments map, and on the left is a map of all the developments that have been converted. NYCHA is currently in planning and engagement with many other developments, which means that there is still an opportunity to say no. The table on the right is both converted developments and those that NYCHA wants to convert. We want to ensure residents across the city know what RAD/PACT is. You can click the link below to access the NYCHA Real Talk map and find more about what's happening in your neighborhood today. NYCHA says residents will benefit from. We've been talking a lot about NYCHA's plan for the buildings and financing. But what actually happens to residents before, during, and after RAD/PACT? What does NYCHA say will happen? And what have the experiences of residents been? NYCHA says residents will benefit from. We want to mention here again that we aren't necessarily supporting this program, but here is how NYCHA says the programs will benefit residents. When a public housing building is converted through RAD/PACT, the new landlord is supposed to make a bunch of renovations and repairs. What kinds of repairs does your building need? Roof replacements, exterior upgrades, new kitchens and bathrooms, renovated common spaces, upgraded lighting, better security, improved outdoor areas. These are all things that NYCHA is supposed to ask the private landlord to do. NYCHA is supposed to consider what the building needs, get resident input, and then share a list of the needed renovations and repairs with the landlord. While some NYCHA residents have felt satisfied with repairs, others have not had good experiences. But residents say otherwise, because NYCHA has not engaged in any formal evaluation process. The resident experiences that we have pulled together in these next few slides have primarily been sourced from a recent Human Rights Watch report detailing RAD/PACT conversions in New York City. What have resident experiences been with repairs and maintenance? Before the conversion takes place, according to some residents, NYCHA stops maintaining the property to the same standard prior, often leaving residents with no recourse. Have residents read quotes if time permits, if not and time is short. Focus on gray boxes. What have resident experiences been with unsafe work practices? Some residents have felt that renovations have been completed utilizing unsafe work practices. During renovations, developers are legally required to submit a tenant protection plan, which is supposed to include efforts to isolate the construction area and contain dust and construction debris. However, as one resident described, workers did not always follow their tenant protection plan. What have resident experiences been with lead-based paint? Recently, a contractor carrying out construction in a PACT development, Independence Towers, admitted to its unsafe work practice. Lead exposure harms our health, yet few avenues exist to remedy the harms we have to endure. We need more accountability. NYCHA says residents will benefit from. We want to mention here again that we aren't necessarily supporting this program. But here is how NYCHA says the programs will benefit residents. When a public housing building is converted through RAD/PACT, the new landlord is supposed to make a bunch of renovations and repairs. What kinds of repairs does your building need? Roof replacements, exterior upgrades, new kitchens and bathrooms, renovated common spaces, upgraded lighting, better security, improved outdoor areas. These are all things that NYCHA is supposed to ask the private landlord to do. NYCHA is supposed to consider what the building needs, get resident input, and then share a list of the needed renovations and repairs with the landlord. While some NYCHA residents have felt satisfied with repairs, others have not had good experiences. But residents say otherwise, because NYCHA has not engaged in any formal evaluation process. The resident experiences that we have pulled together in these next few slides have primarily been sourced from a recent Human Rights Watch report detailing RAD/PACT conversions in New York City. What have resident experiences been with repairs and maintenance? Before the conversion takes place, according to some residents, NYCHA stops maintaining the property to the same standard prior, often leaving residents with no recourse. What have resident experiences been with unsafe work practices? Some residents have felt that renovations have been completed utilizing unsafe work practices. During renovations, developers are legally required to submit a tenant protection plan, which is supposed to include efforts to isolate the construction area and contain dust and construction debris. However, as one resident described, workers did not always follow their tenant protection plan. What have resident experiences been with lead-based paint? Recently, a contractor carrying out construction in a PACT development, Independence Towers, admitted to its unsafe work practice. Lead exposure harms our health, yet few avenues exist to remedy the harms we have to endure. We need more accountability. What have resident experiences been with management responsiveness? Given some of the issues PACT residents have faced, it's important that PACT residents have pathways towards accountability and access to private management to resolve issues. However, some residents consider NYCHA to have often been more responsive than their new property manager under PACT. What have resident experiences been with mold and elevator outages? After renovations, some residents have expressed concerns about superficial repairs and whether those repairs address underlying issues. As some residents have reported, while the renovations look nice, foundational issues such as hot water, heat, and mold continue. Some residents have raised concerns over the durability of the new renovations themselves. Additionally, some residents have also experienced persistent issues regarding elevators. It can be especially daunting to access government agencies to make complaints about repair needs or construction issues, because not only do PACT residents no longer have access to NYCHA's customer center since they now live in a private building, but they also may not have access to 311 since the system may still label the building to be a NYCHA property. This can turn into a never-ending loop and responsibility shifting, with residents caught in the middle. What have resident experiences been like? Rockaway Report. Another report that speaks to resident experiences of RAD conversions is one done by Rockaway Neighbors Helping Neighbors, called Rockiness in the Rockaways. 5 years of RAD at Ocean Bay Houses. Concerned NYCHA residents in Far Rockaway came together to conduct this community survey in order to highlight the experiences of their Ocean Bay neighbors. What have resident experiences been with repairs and maintenance? They found that of the 137 households surveyed, 30% or about 1/3 of respondents were not aware that their homes were a part of the RAD program. First pie chart on left. Pie chart 1 right. Moreover, about half of the respondents were not aware of their rights under RAD. Despite convening a working group of tenants and experts and policymakers to craft a specific set of principles that would accompany leases. The lack of awareness of residents' rights is highly concerning. If tenants are not aware of their rights, how can they advocate for themselves? This is even alarming, as violation of tenants' rights and protections has been a key issue of RAD/PACT identified by legal advocates. Key findings of the report. About a quarter, 25%, were unsatisfied with their housing and quality of life and would move if they could. 40% say conditions have gotten worse or much worse. 21% said it is harder to get repairs, while 35% said it is the same. 35% said there is not an easy-to-use system for submitting requests for repairs. 61% said their rent has gone up. Some residents have reported yearly increases. The report found that rents increased by $365 per month. Key findings. 19% said management tried to evict them. 18% said a neighbor they knew was threatened with eviction or evicted. 35% said they now had to recertify more than once a year. 64% said they now had to recertify with both NYCHA and the private management company. So not every resident is happy with the new changes. In fact, 1 in 6 respondents had been threatened with eviction and or knew a neighbor that had been evicted or threatened with eviction. Additional comments on changes. Almost 30% have noted positive changes including cleaner, safer, improvements like painting, new cabinets, new floors, and repairs. Rules now enforced, i.e., no smoking, pick up dog waster. At the same time, almost 30% noted negative changes including issues with management, like high staff turnover, can't get a hold of management on the phone, shut water off without warning, stairs are locked and that's a fire hazard, increased fees, i.e. laundry room too expensive, $15 to replace keycard, $500 fine if you break a rule, new restrictions on community resources, no barbecue, no community space, no decorating hallways. So although there are some benefits, there are also negative aspects too. What have resident experiences been with repairs and maintenance? In the Rockaway report, residents also expressed dissatisfaction with persistent issues like mold and new rules that have taken away rights/privileges like access to storage rooms and meeting rooms. What have resident experiences been with repairs and maintenance? Most importantly, in addition to evictions and rent increasing, residents found that domestic violence transfers are no longer being processed. In fact, NYCHA residents cannot transfer into PACT developments, nor can PACT residents transfer to NYCHA developments. So accommodation transfers that were in the pipeline before a conversion are typically canceled or denied. This is a huge problem for people with disabilities and survivors of domestic violence. RAD notice. Know your rights. NYCHA has stated that residents will still have most of the same rights they had when their building was public housing. What are some rights you have as NYCHA residents? Residents have the right to pass their apartment on to a loved one. Residents have the right to a hearing if they have grievances. Residents have the right to organize through a residents' association. Residents have the right to return to property without prescreening. Residents have the right to no rent increases if already paying at least 30% of income on rent. Residents have the right to same fair housing, accessibility, and reasonable accommodations rights as prior to RAD conversion, at least on paper. What about accountability? Like the government complaint process discussed earlier, access to accountability measures like a hearing can often turn into a game of hot potato between NYCHA and the private landlord, leaving residents with nowhere to turn for a remedy. Some residents in PACT buildings have struggled to access their right to an informal grievance process and have been taken straight to court for eviction. What about evictions? Government officials and residents alike have expressed concerns about the rise in evictions under a private landlord. Eviction data provided by NYCHA itself shows higher levels of evictions in PACT households compared to NYCHA households. PACT tenancy proceedings and eviction rate. As you might remember, evictions were paused in 2020 during COVID and lifted in 2022. Since then, evictions have steadily gone up. Last year, there were 36 evictions for 2023. In 2024, in only the first half of the year, there were another 36 evictions, and likely more since then. We are deeply concerned about any displacement that may occur from conversions, which is why we want residents to know their rights. What are some of the other things we might worry about? Take a few responses from participants. They might bring up concerns you are not aware of yet. One big thing we might worry about is that in project-based Section 8, tenants pay 30% of their income, no matter what. While in public housing, residents pay up to 30% of their income. Some tenants who are paying a flat-rate rent less than 30% of their income in public housing might end up paying a lot more rent if they have to pay exactly 30% of their income. Another thing we might worry about is who is getting the money. In this program, NYCHA is probably not getting very much money at all. Most of the money is passing straight from the federal government to the private landlord. This means the RAD/PACT program doesn't generate funds for other NYCHA buildings, like traditional public housing. What it does is transfer responsibility for maintaining NYCHA buildings from NYCHA to a private landlord. We may also worry about private landlords taking over management. They don't have to follow through on making repairs and maintenance in the same way that NYCHA does. By court order, NYCHA has to answer to the mold and leak ombudsperson and the NYCHA monitor. Unfortunately, a private landlord isn't accountable to either. They may also be less accountable to elected officials than NYCHA is. Private landlords are also much quicker to sue or threaten to sue tenants for being late with rent or other paperwork. The city calls RAD/PACT a public-private partnership because there's a public partner, NYCHA, and a private partner, the landlord, who work together. If it's a partnership, which partner is responsible for what? This is where it gets complicated. Since the private landlord is leasing the land from NYCHA, the landlord is supposed to do what NYCHA says. But it isn't really clear how NYCHA will monitor the landlord to make sure they are taking care of the building. It also isn't clear how easy it will be for NYCHA to get rid of a bad landlord. Some people worry that over time, public-private partnerships will mean government agencies do less, and the services they used to provide will only be available from private, for-profit companies. If this happened to NYCHA, there might be a lot less public housing in the long run. What is Section 18? For those who may want a deeper understanding of how this is happening, NYCHA must submit a RAD/Section 18 blended application. Section 18 is a tool HUD is currently using to demolish or dispose, transfer public housing apartments to a private entity of public housing. It is part of the paperwork and applications process for RAD/PACT conversions. What is Section 18? Demolition and disposition of our public housing has serious implications for the future of public housing. They are the very tools that end public housing. Public housing is a safety net for many people who would not have housing stability otherwise. Rather than giving up on public housing, we want to nourish and grow public housing. What needs to happen for RAD/PACT to take place? Where and when can you intervene? If NYCHA wants to lease a part of its development, it has to go through the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development (HUD) approval process. This means that they have to show HUD that a few things are true. The plan is in the best interests of current residents. The conversion won't cause any difficulties or mess with how the development functions. NYCHA has developed its plans after talking with residents about them. Additionally, pre-conversion, NYCHA must give notice of conversion as well as details of the conversion. Most importantly, NYCHA must hold several public meetings over the process of developing and approving a conversion plan. NYCHA must also provide responses to resident comments raised at these meetings. This means NYCHA has to listen and respond to resident input. If you disagree with their plans to lease land, attend one of the public meetings or write a letter to make sure your voice is heard. The illustration. During resident engagement, 2 meetings must be held before submitting an application to HUD to explain RAD, plans for the campus, and to receive resident feedback. After those meetings, NYCHA can submit initial paperwork to start the process of the RAD process, called a CHAP, commitment to enter into a housing assistance payment contract. Then, NYCHA must hold 2 meetings with residents after the CHAP is accepted and before the PHA has a concept call with HUD. After those 2 meetings, NYCHA corresponds with HUD for the concept call and develops a financing plan to submit to HUD. If HUD approves, there must be one more meeting after HUD approves, also now called RCC for RAD conversion commitment, and prior to closing. The PHA must review the conversion timing, work changes to the lease and house rules, and any anticipated relocation. All these things must happen before closing. Once a conversion is closed, the deal is final and the buildings are now owned by a new entity. What needs to happen for RAD/PACT to take place? Also, please note that there are regulations NYCHA must adhere to when it comes to resident participation accessibility at meetings. If NYCHA's PACT team is currently engaging your development and you see this is missing, please let us know. How are these programs different? If you remember at the beginning, we talked about the 4 main programs of NYCHA. They were RAD/PACT, the Preservation Trust, Infill, and Transfer of Development Rights. This slide shows the basic differences between the first 3, in case you want to advocate for one over another. RAD/PACT. You will live in a building managed by a private landlord instead of NYCHA. Building is converted from public housing, Section 9, to privately managed Section 8 housing. Ongoing payments from the government and the tenants will go to the private landlord instead of NYCHA. How are these programs different? Infill, also called Build to Preserve. If your development gets a new infill building, NYCHA will still manage your property. A new building replaces the land on your NYCHA campus that might be a playground or parking lot or lawn right now. NYCHA says that money raised will be used to make repairs to your NYCHA building, but money isn't being raised right now. Transfer of development rights, also called transfer to preserve. NYCHA still manages your building, and no new buildings are built on NYCHA property. NYCHA makes money by selling unused development rights to private developers to build new buildings near NYCHA property. One-time payment from the developer is used to make repairs to your NYCHA building. What's going on in your development? These programs are going into place in NYCHA and other parts of the US. For example, RAD has been done in cities like Chicago, Philadelphia, and San Francisco. The NYCHA Annual Plan and NYCHARealtalk.org are both places you can find out more about what's planned for your development. Here are a few ways that NYCHA residents can get involved in organizing around RAD/PACT and other NYCHA programs. Get involved in your NYCHA resident association. This is a good way to find out if the city or NYCHA plans to bring any of these programs to your development. Talk to your neighbors. If NYCHA holds public meetings about these programs in your NYCHA development, show up and make your voice heard. Contact local community organizations that are organizing around these NYCHA strategies. Contact your city council member and let them know if you think RAD/PACT, infill, or TDR are good things for NYCHA to do. If you are currently undergoing planning and engagement and see an issue with how NYCHA is behaving, feel free to submit a complaint to HUD. What can you do to get involved? Please check the How to Get Involved section of the newsletter, as well as the list of phone numbers for your positions. If you have any questions or found this presentation helpful, please complete the survey attached to the newsletter. Thank you so much for listening and learning. This was a lot of information to take in, and our goal is to ensure NYCHA residents fully understand their rights. Feel free to reach out if you want to keep the conversation going.